Hi everyone, I'm JR Maycock, and yeah, today's actually going to be kind of a relaxing conversation. It's not actually a high-paced or ugly one in any sort of form. The topic, as you can tell on the screen, is data protection for Microsoft 365, and that means that I'm going to heavily tilt this in a couple of directions. Those being, in particular, that I want to tilt this towards the software as a service applications. And just as much as well as some of the administration layer for Microsoft 365. So I came to the knowledge about this topic in what would be a pretty roundabout way. I've been doing some form of IT work, even starting in the freelance time, for about 14 years. And for the first 8 or 9 of that, only the on-premise world existed to me. SaaS stuff is something that wasn't in my horizon of knowledge until the middle of the 2010s. And I think that there's been a period of time, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, where the availability of products and feature sets inside of a platform like Microsoft 365 have managed to outstrip the availability of other complementary pieces of administration policy and automation components and integration with the overall data protection strategy that a business may already have in place for pieces of their IT estate. That for a while, the development cadence of the entire Microsoft platform outran the ability to actually protect the data in place. So I want to try and talk today about closing that gap. I think that a couple of very important feature consolidations have happened from within the platform to help answer these questions. I think that enough time has gone by for some third-party vendors to begin to participate. And I think that our collective familiarity with the platform has grown to where we can really start addressing the details of it all. So today certainly has a strategic element to the talk, describing this from a fairly high level and policy-based approach. But there's a lot of implementation detail that I'm hoping to put in here as well. And as we go along, if anything raises a question of interest, or if we need to dive deeper into some kind of example content that isn't already what I'm talking about and we just switch over to it, I'm open to all sorts of diversions. There's really no mandatory preset track here. We're not on that much of a cadence, and if something piques interest ahead of anything else, let's explore it deeper. So please don't be shy, interrupt freely. Let's go for it. All right. So apparently that's just not going to display perfectly. Let's see if we can actually get that to show up a little better. So I wrote a decent-sized paragraph here that says, organizations deserve to know the division of responsibility between Microsoft and themselves. And display funkiness aside, the shared responsibility model is not something that a lot of people have bothered to understand in detail. The standard assumption that someone tends to make day one they turn on a Microsoft 365 subscription is somehow because these are services or products consumed as a service, it's just taken care of for you. That somehow all the data protection and all of the governance features and all of the user security will just come baked in and there's no more effort anymore. And I'm positive there is a group of sales individuals over time who have benefited from propagating that myth, but it is just a myth. In fact, there is a very specific division of responsibility between what every end user organization still maintains responsibility for versus what Microsoft maintains responsibility for. And fortunately, Microsoft is kind enough to lay out in fairly significant detail what that responsibility diagram looks like. So this diagram is laid out so that the vertical columns proceed from the left side being software as a service over to the right side being full on-premise and hybrid degrees in the middle. And then everything that is colored in this blue color is indicated as being responsibility by the end user organization. Everything in the gray color is something you can say Microsoft has total responsibility for. 50-50 boxes are a blend. This entire presentation this way will be sent out on Meetup and everything, so any of the links contained in here, don't worry about trying to scribble them down, because the picture captions will have them, and this will be freely published forever, so easy to do. The piece that I need to draw everyone's attention to is actually in that very far left-hand column, where the largest amount of the gray boxes appear, software as a service realm. So Microsoft clearly has responsibility for all of the physical operations of whatever computers make this work. You know, everyone goes with the name the cloud, but every time I hear that, I just translate cloud to mean other people's computers, right? So Microsoft runs the computers, and they design the application code. But the moment it comes to deciding the use of user accounts to access the applications, the management of individual devices that people touch in order to get to that data, and then the integrity and contents of the data inside the applications, that's all a responsibility that sits directly with the end user organization. So to go a little bit more specific, this diagram is extremely high level and is saying at a conceptual foundational basis for everything Microsoft offers, including all of Azure, what does the division of responsibility shake out to be? Fortunately, another organization was nice enough to write this slightly more comprehensible little flow diagram for us, which is in the context of Office 365 specifically, what responsibility sits with customer versus Microsoft. And the area that I really want to throw attention to is the second column from the left, supporting technology column. That being that Microsoft very much takes care of the data replication layer for Office 365. When you store data or use features, Microsoft has deep high availability baked in and is making sure that instances of those data are spread across different areas of the world and are available across multiple DNS infrastructures, and try and do a good job of staying online and accessible. We can all make the nice jokes about counting down from 365 and saying it's going to be Microsoft 363 or 356 or whatever this year with certain service outages, but overall they do a good job. And it does say it's their responsibility to ensure service layer is active. They also keep very limited short-term recoverability in the form of certain recycle bins. Deleted objects from various Office 365 services tend to stick around for a time period anywhere in between 14 to 90 days, depending on the service. And you can usually recover from a deleted state if you notice it fast enough. But non-deterministic timelines that are pretty short aren't a good data protection strategy. Having to notice something goes wrong in time to recover it isn't a good data protection strategy. And anything in a recycle bin, if the event you need to protect yourself from is a cybersecurity compromise where administrative credentials were stolen, recycle bins can very much be erased. Those are not anywhere near highly protected, immutable, safe states. With very simple commands, a administrator rogue credential set can say, let's delete the production copy, let's destroy it from the recycle bin, one-way trip, goodbye. So the responsibility to actually try and take a backup instance of the data or to execute data restoration from older points in time of specific versions or after a default retention length, that will always sit with the end user organization. And more specifically, it means you need to make configuration changes. You need to deliberately set out to declare what the data policy for Microsoft 365 data should be, and then enact some things that aren't turned on by default in your tenant or your customer's tenants or your business division tenants, and make them stick. Fortunately, it's not all that hard to work on in the end. The final thing I wanted to show was, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I've seen this before, and the one thing that I wish they would add to this is the point in time restore that's available through Microsoft in some supporting technologies. So the recycling bin is there, it's available, but there is also a point in time restore for 90 days for SharePoint and a few of the other technologies. That does give you, if deleted through admin, and the admin recycling bin, you can still restore back. Caveat there is it restores back an entire cycle.
Correct. So if you're trying to get a single file back, you're out of luck. You have to do the whole data collection at once.
Microsoft will tell you they will not restore the site collection from different site collections. They will. Hopefully, no one ever has to do that. But yeah, it's the one thing I wish they would change to this model.
Yeah. this little line right there of no point in time recovery maybe needs to be called into factual question. 5 words need to have an asterisk nearby that says, well, except for SharePoint and except for.
Yeah, you submit a ticket and they premiere or non-premiere, and then they'll do the restore for you. It takes, so depending on the size of the restore point, they claim it can take up to 14 days. I've seen very large, near terabytes that happen in less than 12 hours. So it does happen quickly, and they just basically do it the SQL restore to the content database.
Yep. Fortunately, there is a self-service answer we're going to go over for that within retention policy to give you the ability to do that without contacting Microsoft and to get some granularity back. All right. So again, with funny text sizes, but we can just scroll a little bit. I wanted to quantify where Microsoft declares in any formal contractual language that the responsibility for backup and data protection sits with you, the customer. And I did find at least one very easy place. And that's in the primary Microsoft Services Agreement that is the, what you call the standard end user license agreement for all Office 365 services. And Section 6B contains this little line of recommending that you regularly back up the content and that the info you store on the services needs to be treated as stuff you own. This is not exceptionally explicit. It would be nice if they were more explicit in the language, but there at least is some reference that says, no, really, do something about it. We aren't doing it for you. It's in our official terms. So something to stand on. I need to make a small diversion. There's some security best practices that kind of influence the whole. If your data protection strategy doesn't have these in place, you're going to have a bad first time you try to use it. And while these aren't exceptionally germane to data protection itself, unless you have these best practices in place, I really doubt that your protection strategy will be successful because it can be undone too simply. And you'll probably have to invoke the data protection elements of the disaster restore plan too often. So these are not reinventing the wheel, but maybe it's a personal bias. I can never manage to give any of these discussions without at least taking a couple minutes of someone's time and just saying, please, turn these on. No more excuses. Get these best practices locked in place. I've only got 4 of them, but the first of them right here is either turning on security defaults or conditional access policies. If you have any Azure Active Directory license that's a premium one, P1, P2, or it's embedded in any of your SKUs, you can turn on conditional access. If you don't, no matter how basic your subscription is, if you have one license of just Exchange Online Kiosk Plan 1, $2 a month, you can still turn on the security default setting. This global security enablement is brand new to the end of last year, I'm pretty sure. Maybe even January of 2020 is it went GA in wider set of tenants. So for late 2018 and 2019, Microsoft started putting together baseline policies in conditional access that were always in preview mode and turned on certain fundamental pieces, those being that users must register for multi-factor authentication, though it won't be interrogated to them on every service use, just risky sign-ons. Every admin must have MFA turned on, will be interrogated on every sign-in, including for Azure App Portal usage, for any of the Office 365 portals, for PowerShell, all of it. That legacy authentication should be blocked, meaning no more very old mail protocols or very old multifunction printers logging in with legacy auth. Those baseline policies, however, are now being deprecated in fashion of something a lot more effective, in my mind. Which is funny because they only got the preview tag removed late last year, and then a few months later, they're being just vacated out. There is instead, if you browse to your Azure Active Directory admin panel, on that master left-hand navigation blade, there's a properties dialog box, and it shows you some things like your tenant ID. But down on the bottom of that dialog box, there's a clickable blue text link that says Manage Security Defaults and brings up a yes/no toggle. If you toggle that on, it will turn on the equivalent of those baseline policies. like what we said about having users register for MFA, even if they aren't enforced on every sign-in, only abnormal ones, having every admin account require MFA every time, and having legacy authentication turned off. This being available to single seat licenses of the most basic conceivable SKUs is something I'm very impressed for Microsoft to have done. They gated access to some of these features behind all the way up at Azure Active Directory P2 licensing for a long time. And I thought that was fairly unacceptable, and I'm positive that all of us as members of the partner community and customer community stepped on them for a long time and said, come on, it's 2020, we need fundamental baselines that are better. This is the answer. If you do have licensing that lets you turn on conditional access, however, you should use that instead. Because there's a very simple document at the link that's here on the page that says, okay, to create the equivalent of the baseline security, turn on these 3 or 4 things. And why it helps you out is it lets you set up a little bit more granularity. You can cause even further levels of scrutiny to be applied to different types of sign-on signals around administrative usage. And you can also set up more exclusion pieces rather than one baseline element across the whole tenant.
Would you mind? I think that one of the biggest things that I see that I want to do is Maycock. Would you mind explaining the importance of basic auth and why MFA alone is not secure?
Yes. So basic authentication is using an older non-SAML-based protocol, and it accepts both unencrypted transporter credentials, which is a problem. There are ways to use basic auth that aren't using HTTPS, and it will allow the combination of a username and a password to authenticate directly and doesn't have any tie-in to the modern authentication framework. It bypasses MFA, even if it's turned on for a user. The only place left that is a workaround that's Microsoft sanctioned is the use of app passwords. And that's sort of in this quasi-gray area. But basic auth is a really, really severe security risk to have it enabled on your tenant because you can't lock it out on a per user account basis, which is particularly bad for the admin accounts. And it allows both insecure transporter credentials and the use of credentials. So if someone gets it phished, for instance, that then shuts down all the upstream security mechanisms on modern auth that are supposed to prevent bad effects. Anything else you would add?
No, I think that anytime where we've seen a security incident that is involved, they usually have a false sense of security because they have that enabled. Now this is probably a year ago before security defaults was really an option. So we need to turn on what we would find is that basic auth was being used to bypass to get access to Exchange. That was really the attack vector that was being used and still is being used for any legacy tenants that have. So if you learn anything today, I would say go check to make sure you do not have basic auth.
Chris?
So the one problem that I have with security defaults is it eliminates your ability to have a break glass account. You can lose total access to your tenant.
I do hear you on that. In fact, we're going to address it in just a couple seconds with the best workaround I know of. So in the meantime on that, actually last thought on basic auth. The tenant creation date will matter. If your Microsoft 365 or Office 365 tenant was created before calendar year 2017, you almost certainly do have basic auth on as your tenant initial configuration, and you have to go modify it. Tenants created post 2018, or certainly anything being created now, actually do have it disabled by default until you go and re-enable it. And anything in the middle of those dates, if you're not sure, check it. So next piece of security best practices. Confusingly, unified audit logging isn't turned on the time you create your tenant. I don't know why. It seems like a really easy little toggle switch that should be turned on by default. And it doesn't require any of the additional subscription licenses or creation of something like a log analytics workspace. Instead, from the Office 365 Compliance Center, which is that URL, protection.office.com, there is a toggle switch that the first time you go to the audit log search, it says, do you need to enable this for your tenant? Yes, please. You hit yes, little in progress icon spins for like 60 to 90 seconds, and then it works from there. And audit logging in this case is what's going to be recording all of the events that tie a user principal name or a system account to a outcome action. So something gets modified, changed, deleted, login attempts, all of that content that goes way beyond. So Azure Active Directory will always track logins, but it won't track the use of accounts and any administrative actions taken, what happens to files, what happens to emails, what happens to permission sets, unless you turn on this audit log. And then it's all kept for really deep, sophisticated searching. So this is a really fast 2-minute thing that you should just double check on. Good old separation of accounts. I don't actually think there are that many places anymore that still roll where your day-to-day productivity email account is assigned the global admin role. But I still see a lot of places that assign a lesser admin role like help desk or Exchange or SharePoint, some product-specific administration to a productivity account. And I'm going to request to please knock it off. Creating additional administrator accounts and leaving them unlicensed is perfectly fine for the extreme majority of use cases. Rarely do you have to pay an extra license for it. In the use cases where you need to offer sophisticated login stuff, you can subscribe to just Azure AD Premium to apply to this account. It doesn't need any Office 365 products. And I know of at least 2 good ways to get a username scheme in place that makes it really easy to work with these guys, which is either suffixing .edm to the end of the username, or if you want to look at this from more the traditional how you would enact a enhanced security forest separated tiered accounts in on-premise Active Directory infrastructure, something like the attribution of tier 0 being fundamental all-controlling global domain admin, tier 1 being service admin, tier 2 being help desk end user administrator. You can suffix T0, T1, and T2 after the usernames. I do recommend making, for just the ease of distinction, keeping the UPNs in your on Microsoft initial tenant establishment domain instead of your actual business operations email domain. It helps make sure people make as few mistakes as possible in separating those accounts out. And if anyone wants to talk about an extra piece, we can probably put it on after this presentation or come talk about it. I've got a way to make this as easy as possible from a quality of life point of view of browser sessions and logging into about 7 or 8 Microsoft accounts simultaneously in a single browser without them clobbering each other's tokens. So there's a way around even that piece. Assign the global admin roles to the T0, assign lesser admin roles to T1 and T2 if you're separating them, or if they're unified, stick to .adm. Do all administrative work under the separate account. Do no productivity work under that account. No email, no messaging. Just is intrinsically less risky for getting stuff phished or doing anything else. Final piece. Break glass accounts. So the official guidance at that URL on the screen is create between 1 and 3 administrator accounts that are totally separate from your normal usage, that are not named after an individual, but are instead named after something for the organization, that do have the global admin role and that do not use your standard multi-factor authentication setup. Then either make them get secured by having something like a separate smart card dedicated to that account, or what's a lot more practical for most organizations is give that account something like a 16-word passphrase, because Azure AD password length is now 256 characters long. Just use the Diceware method, get yourself 16 words off of the EFF's long Diceware wordless dictionary, print them on either 2 or 3 pieces of paper, lock them in 2 or 3 separate safes and safe deposit boxes that require individuals who normally own high-value business processes to unlock them, and use those accounts when everything else is wrong. Truly the break glass scenario. You can do this if you have conditional access licensing, because you can exempt an account from a specific MFA registration policy. If you turn on the security defaults, then this account will be subject to MFA registration at the time of its sign-in, which means the one workaround I have available is don't sign into the account for the first time. Create this account from another administrator account, set the password to the known value, and have it be when you need to invoke the break glass, when you have no other working accounts, register MFA against an office phone line, an email, something that is still working and surviving even in the disaster scenario when you log into it the first time. It's good enough for 90 to 95% of the break glass cases, in my opinion. Any other thoughts on that one, Rustin?
Only two things that I can say to these two things is that I disagree with you using ADM, admin, whatever in the username.
Too predictable?
And yes, that any malware, any hacker that gets access to the tip, that does a search on the Google catalog is going to be looking for those kinds of usernames. And that's, I think a random username is a better choice for those kind of situations.
Sure. My counterpoint would be this keeps the audit log clean, and I put all the protection in the upstream layers past the username. You can know the username. I'll put those on the billboard of every username in my tenant. You just can't know the passwords and any of the authentication secrets.
What does it take to privilege to be able to escalate the user rather than having the user set as a goal?
Yep. Azure AD P2 licensing. And yes, that is indeed a wonderful and powerful solution that I'm not embedding into my best practices discussion here, but deserves its own exploration. Just-in-time assignment of administration rights on a per request basis instead of permanent assignments of roles to accounts. So yes, PIM is beautiful. PIM is life. If you can do it, absolutely. Okay. So enough of that diversion. Thank you for sacrificing the few minutes of your life to it. It's the one that I can never skip for some reason. I want to talk about what data needs to be protected, where it is sourced from. What is the source of truth, original production copy in Office 365 or some other piece of the M365 service ecosystem, and then what levels of protection need to be afforded that data. So, continue onwards. Oh yeah, this side note. I like to build this taxonomy that's about the type of the data itself instead of the Microsoft product name. So the product name applied is sort of the second tier child object compared to the type of the data that actually needs to be protected in how we're going to look at this. File-based data probably has a fair chance at being the most valuable out of everything you can protect. So file content itself is almost always going to be in either some version of SharePoint Online. And whether that's front-ended to a user as being something in OneDrive for Business, in a SharePoint library, in what they see as that place in Teams, a Files tab, it is all under the hood, still in the same storage ecosystem of SharePoint Online. The other place that people still keep a lot of file-based data and will forever cling to using it as a repository, despite probably all of our IT admin preferences, is Exchange Online and email attachments. I got that one email 6 years ago that had that PDF file that decides whether or not we seal this $10 million deal. Clearly. Oh, and it's in my deleted items folder, so, Revision histories are also an interesting concept to grapple with here because the default revision history protection level in OneDrive and SharePoint Online is 500 revisions. You can configure that to be larger if you choose, but you also just need to take into account that the state of data as it changes may have value. Your business may need to actually reference some specific prior instant, and designing a protection policy that at least tries to say, data changes, we do need to keep revisions over time, not just the most recent version. It's worthwhile to put a little effort into. And I think that that is actually accelerating in need because more and more co-editing and collaboration is happening. It's normal now from my experience in my organization that instead of I will create a document and send a version to someone, they will save it, make edits, send it back to me. We all just coexist on the same document, right? We live edit in either the thick applications, the web applications for all sorts of Office files, which means revision histories that contain certain points in the edit chain become extra valuable.
Interesting on that one. We did a little bit of a study on that. It's on-prem, moved to Office 365. They had a 10x increase in version history by moving to Office 365 just off of line editing because of the way that it saves versions. So 500 sounds like a lot, but in the context of 10 people working on a document every few minutes, someone stops in the case of version, it doesn't really 500 is a lot.
want to go back to that, 550th version ago, and it's gone. Everyone's like, I thought version control was turned on. So it's better to be aware of these settings in advance.
Very much so. That's the nice thing of when we get to the retention policy in just a couple minutes. You can change from count-based revisions to time-based revisions. So regardless of the number of edits, if you need to go back 1 year, 3 years, whatever arbitrary time length that you need to choose, you can define the policy around that time instead of around the count. Okay, collaboration stuff. So email is the traditional one, and it will never die because it serves a good purpose. You know, it's the best way, especially going outside your own organization, and it lives in Exchange Online. Calendars are also there, and people really live and die by the presence and fidelity of that calendar data. There is a lot of business process that is tied up into it. I mean, happens in the IT administration realm. I know that there is a group calendar in my organization's environment that is keeping track of support renewals and some really old non-automatable SSL certificate stuff, right? So that calendar data, whether attached to an individual user account, or I guess I didn't print shared mailbox on this slide, or a group account, an Office 365 group that has a mailbox, it exists in Exchange Online, and it definitely needs to be protected and known and acknowledged. Instant messaging messages in Teams operate in a bit of a quirky way. Teams is this incredibly beautiful service abstraction. It is an interface that is not a product in and of itself. It instead is this litany of underlying products that all surface information collectively to this one application. But as a result of that underlying heterogeneity, the chats tab in Teams, what happens either on a one-to-one basis or a multi-party chat, actually gets stored in Exchange Online. It's in a special folder structure. You won't see it as part of a mailbox when you load it into something like an Outlook client, but the actual place that those chats, those pieces of message text get stored are inside of an Exchange Online user account as part of the Exchange database structure. And this is in opposition to how channels work in a Teams team / Office 365 group. All of that content is instead stored in the SharePoint online subsection and storage area dedicated to that particular team. So it's interesting that that ends up bifurcated. And while maybe I should have done that before this. I don't think I've ever dug so deep under the hood to confirm that a message copy in a chat between two people is always stored twice in both mailboxes. I suspect it is. I suspect that both the sender and the receiver get a copy retained.
Another weird one there is if you have an external user, like if you log in with another account, you chat with somebody, it actually creates a profile name for that external user.
Yep. Guest users do get their own service principal identities within your tenant. Final part that I tossed on here is more and more organizations are using workload and project tracking and task-based software that's in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. So products like Planner and To-Do and the Shifts subsection or app within Teams are all also data sources that may matter. If your organization is spending any significant amount of time putting the work tracking into any of those products, you really don't want to have to lose that, because the ability to recreate that in situ based on where you are in a project is extremely painful and carries a degree of financial risk that I think almost anyone outside of project management wouldn't understand. But if you ever get to talk to a project manager about this and tell them, it's basically their equivalent of the worst horror movie and ghost story you can think of. It is nightmares and cold sweats from their point of view. Administrative data, kind of a hidden data category, because it doesn't have a representation as a file or directly as part of a piece of a user database. But all of this data is the glue or the metadata that actually makes the tenant work. So all of the permissions set within something like Exchange Online that say who has full access to what shared mailbox, what alternate mailbox, what send as permissions, all of the attribution of particular SharePoint Online libraries, hubs, sites to individuals or Active Directory Azure AD groups, and then the assignment of particular roles in Azure AD to particular accounts. All of that really matters to making the product work, because it doesn't matter if you actually have all of the source of truth ultimate data down the line intact if no one can access it. So that part definitely counts to protect and keep track of. Group titles and memberships in Azure AD, they matter. And then our good old friend, the audit log that we recommended turning on, all of that is actually kept inside of, at the very back end, something like an Azure Log Analytics workspace. But how you interact with it, the service endpoint you can talk to and use to bring down that data, is the Microsoft Graph Security API. So anytime you have a compliance requirement in your organization to be able to prove, disprove, validate, or do forensics around what happened and when, grappling with that audit log and looking at that service endpoint will matter. Okay, and then there's this one, which I guess is the catch-all for everything else from my point of view, but I just called it application data. This is the first time we're going to toss the product names directly as the organization area. But data that you either create in Microsoft Forms as the form to be input, or what's ultimately captured on the form, SharePoint framework content and web parts, and Office add-ins. All those sort of cluster up to me as this is content that is created dynamically by the business, has value, and needs to be able to be recreated or be brought back if it were ever damaged. And the very nice thing about these use of these products is they tend to save a lot of time, provide a lot of efficiency to the business, which means 2 months, 4 months, 12 months after they get deployed, what may have seemed like just sort of a casual, we did it in an afternoon solution, suddenly becomes a lot more critical. And its absence from the business afterwards will cause pain and cause loss of dollars. And then there's our very big, very friendly one of Power BI. And this is an area where I'm probably not as educated as I would love to be for precisely how to execute the data protection, because Power BI reports and the analysis layer on top of underlying data sets requires a different approach than the data sets themselves. A lot of Power BI data sets don't have uniqueness. They're copies of other databases or sourced from somewhere. But the reports have a ton of uniqueness and represented a huge amount of time investment for someone to create them. So make sure if you're using that product inside your company, have a strategy that at least addresses the need to separately maintain and keep additional copies of, give survivability to not just the data sets, but the expression of the data sets. Anyone ever actually executed a Power BI backup piece when you're using Microsoft Cloud stuff? Yeah, this is kind of a gooey one. I think this is probably, out of anything we're talking about today, this is probably the least explored. So maybe it's our collective homework to go figure this out. We'll post it back. And then the product by which we can never tell its name because it changes every little while. This should be Automate, I would imagine, that are Power Apps or flow-based things now. I think that's the most current name, but okay, protection levels for this data. So right off the bat, it's worth noting why we're spending so much time talking about SaaS. And that is because the need for protection is the most acute there. You generate a very large volume of data into those SaaS applications as a business. It changes transactionally and constantly. It represents direct economic value, yet it has no protection layer of its own. It's not like that data is part of an infrastructure ecosystem that you have other protection strategies already set to go. That's what you might experience if you're using a file server or some kind of, an on-premise exchange. But the ability to protect that data, it really still matters to the business. And my ask in that next part is that you draw a correlation in between the rate of change of the data and what degree of protection you offer. So very fast changing data, especially emails and documents, need protection horizons that are as close to real time as you can squeeze them. So taking a strategy that is only able to generate safe additional copies once every 7 days, 14 days for that type of high turnover transaction data, I wouldn't trust it. I think that going sub-daily is very important for high transaction content. The same goes the more your business depends on something like a business analytics platform or is dependent upon some piece of an app that is exposed through SharePoint or Teams, protect it fast, protect it quickly. You know, give that the same degree of precision and protection that you would afford to your internal Active Directory infrastructure, your on-premise high turnover customer database SQL server. Treat them that kind of seriously, I guess is my call to action there. The other call to action is discussing the risk with business decision makers and especially people who influence budget. It is almost always cheaper to design and do at least some manner of protection with additional copies and a data policy than it is to have to recreate the stuff afterwards. And it is not a question of if you will have to recreate something, it is a question of when. The loss of even one workday for 5 or 6 people represents thousands of dollars of labor and tens of thousands of dollars of revenue and lost customer confidence and everything else. The ask for the storage systems or the software or the developer time or any of the other pieces that enable the data protection to work makes sense. That math balances out. This is not a crazy sell. This is not something that is actually a terribly difficult, hard conversation to convince. The missing piece is just generally laying out the underlying facts, explaining that data protection is not an automatic feature of just subscribing to M365, that there is still an internal responsibility within an organization or within organizations that your organization services to deal with this layer, and that you can generally access protection on a strategy basis that is operational expenditure, that you can actualize it for a few extra dollars per user. Even if that's not how you pay for the stuff underneath, you can certainly relate it to a budgetary decision maker that way. A few incremental extra dollars per user inside the tenant to make it all come together. Cool. So let's implement some protections. Yeah, we're doing pretty good on time. Your first line of defense should be the data governance features. And in particular, the data governance feature that I want to call your attention to today is retention policy. Now, data governance is a truly wonderful and deep topic to explore that is well outside the conversation what we can do today. So I don't know if I'm shortchanging everyone, but why don't we go with, I'm certainly taking a very, very small slice of a very big pie to talk about today, but it is the one that has the most immediate impact as a data protection element. So through 2018, you generally configured on a per application basis how to retain the content. Fortunately, that's different now. That's part of what I was alluding to at the very introduction of this talk of some feature consolidation and some maturity that's finally come together. The retention policy configuration can now be done on a tenant-wide basis. It targets either users or groups, including the selection of all, everyone, no matter who they are, and is a very, very simple configuration to turn on the first time and create just a basic rational policy element. You can get to the same policy engine through 2 pages. Both URLs are listed here, either the M365 Compliance Center or Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. I suspect that the M365 one is the winner of those 2 platforms in the long run. More features are going towards that one, but it truly doesn't matter which of those 2 interfaces you choose today, you'll get the same wizard. The only remaining schism is that when you go to that wizard and you say new data protection policy, you give the policy a name, the next page that's going to have you make some selections is going to list what Office 365 products, what you want included in the protection scope, and what users. If you toggle on the protection switches, yeah, they're binary switches, for Teams, it actually toggles off all of the other switches. For some reason, you have to have a separate protection policy for Teams. You can't combine that single component or that single product with the rest of them. But that is the only remaining schism I've found. Everything else, Exchange and SharePoint and all of the other data sources that are under the scope of a data governance or protection policy are unified. And you can just say either target this group of people and all their content, or target the whole tenant, which is my favorite way to go with at least one default protection policy. And then you can set a retention length, number of years, or you can toggle it forever if you feel like it. There is not an additional cost expressed to your organization for choosing these protection items. They scale up automatically with your tenant, and Microsoft simply builds them in as a core element of the service, which is nice. This approach isn't good enough by itself, though. And the main reason I'm going to suggest that is because you don't have any additional non-production copy. This is effectively the same logical flaw as if you were relying on data replication without a backup strategy for traditional infrastructure. Replication is not backup, and data governance is not data protection. Very useful, wonderful first line of defense, and whatever you can restore from that type of infrastructure, you should. It is easy, it is efficient, it is in the same place. But it is not a holistic strategy, and it is not good enough if you leave it alone. So that leads me to should we call it an axiom? A really old one. Something that a whole bunch of colleagues who are smarter than me at even this area have called timeless for a long time. That's the 3-2-1 rule of backup, which in its classic form has been expressed as generally this sentence. 3 copies, production is one of those 3. 2 independent media, one of them off-site, not in your same building. We need to grapple with this rule and recontextualize it to get at the essence of the same logical foundation, but carry it forward into how does it matter for hybrid cloud infrastructure and especially the consumption of software as a service. So here's what I tried to come up with. 3 copies of your data element still stays intact. The production is 1 copy. The data protection elements we just talked about are an excellent second copy. And then you need at least 1 more copy in a separate administrative realm. And I think that is the most important single ideological nexus to look at here. Whatever administrative horizon decides access and use of your production systems, do not use that same thing to do your backup systems, to do your data protection realm. The lateral transfer of administrative permissions is by far the greatest risk you face, because these are software as a service components. It's extremely unlikely someone gets to go physically steal it, right? They're not going to rip a disk and get your data that way. It's extremely unlikely they're doing a network-based, sniff the ones and zeros attack. There are very sophisticated transport protections in place. So short of nation-state adversaries, what you're actually looking at is credentials compromise and misuse of either a user account and its access to data, or more importantly, an administrative account and its access to make changes to the whole realm. So that is probably the biggest focus of how we can recontextualize this rule. Instead of talking about different kinds of media, where the risk the business was trying to protect itself from was something intrinsic to how disks could go wrong versus optical stuff versus tape. The equivalent risk horizon is administrative realms. If you are using the same administrative realm to try and offer data protection, it's not safe. And while we can go to great lengths for correctly configuring administrative realms and using logical protections, there is almost no substitute for just having a separate one and making it so lateral compromise is impossible. And the same amount of work that went into doing the first compromise has to be done a second time to a whole second environment. That really, really raises the difficulty curve and gives you a lot better protection. So that's the 3-part. What about the 2-part? Well, that administrative domain and that data protection and disaster recovery realm can be used for a lot of components, and that's the equivalent to separation of media. The 1 part. Call it 1+. It needs to be enhanced. It can't just be off-site because the original copy is off-site, right? Like the site becomes this abstract concept of how do we access the service. It no longer has a defined physical location. It's everywhere and it's nowhere. So you have to actually put that protection copy, that additional instance of the data, into a site that you deliberately designate. We know one thing about it, the administrative realm piece, but what other attributes would be positive to experience? What would make a good choice of a site? Well, best case in my mind is something that is offline and air-gapped. So if you can find ways to write data to cycling media that has absolutely no network-based access at all, you are in the best possible position, because you've taken it from the worst case logical compromise can somehow get to that data to someone has to physically break into that stuff and go get the physical instance along with the same amount of logical compromise. Automating that is the hard part, right? Because offlining something in a regular, reliable, non-human interactive way, messy. So one of the next best things I suggest is choosing a protected service provider location, a company that is more dedicated to data protection than just a generalized public cloud storage area. And I mean, in the interest of full transparency, I need to disclose that's something that my company does, right? Like that is a service of Perpetual Storage who I'm employed by. But this is sort of a chicken and egg relationship where I don't think that it's we are a company and do that thing, therefore it's a good idea. It's the other way around. That's a good idea to do and we happen to be fulfilling it. So I recommend that if it is impractical to examine something that can actually be a physical air gap, choosing a service provider that is dedicated to data protection and has additional types and protection layers in place and is able to abstract that risk away from you, to have the service provider assume the liability and have contractual guarantees and process guarantees that prove their ability to provide a meaningful service is a great way to go. The next best alternative would be a public cloud environment or a storage system you control that, could just be built out of a computer that is not the same as the production one. So either go cross-cloud, Azure versus AWS versus all sorts of ways to abstract public cloud stuff, or create an object storage repository of your own, or any way to just make it be that you are consuming expressible storage that is simple to access. You can configure a system to target it with these extra data copies that you can take ownership over, but that is not in the same immediate access cloud provider, both from an administrative realm and from a service availability point of view as the production copy. Any clarifying questions on this? Cool. Okay, let's execute a little protection here. Obviously, I'm going to great lengths to emphasize you need to get additional copies of this data. The SaaS production copy isn't good enough, and the data governance copy isn't good enough. So one way to do that is there are third-party commercial products that can execute that workload for you. There are lots of providers in this space. I list a few of them here: Veeam, AvePoint, Skykick. They follow different architectures, which is interesting. Some of them are a cloud-to-cloud service where you're actually configuring another SaaS application to do your backup for you. Others are infrastructure you run and own directly. So for instance, the AvePoint and Veeam options on here are software you execute on a machine, some server or computer that is doing work. The Skykick option and the Druva options are cloud-to-cloud style. I've had exposure to probably 6 or 7 products in this area. If I had to try and say which one gave me the best experience, I think Veeam probably has the most mature option here. But none of them are totally perfect. You should be cognizant of remaining data gaps and products or pieces of the ecosystem that these can't handle. And I think the most important factor in deciding on what third-party offering you should go with really isn't around the pricing structure nearly as much as it is the update cadence. If the last major version release of this product is 2.5 years old and it's completely static, that's a very bad sign, right? Completely new realms and capabilities are being introduced to M365 on a monthly and a quarterly basis. The cadence of constant development and continuous release of new capabilities under the same service moniker is part and parcel of what makes the product good. So you need the third-party software to have a way to grapple with that, to not get stuck in time and get left behind. Another way that you can do this for self-service stuff is PowerShell-based exports. There are commandlets for every service we have talked about today that can query the state of something and output it to something readable. This is particularly important for the data categories that we targeted as administrative and as application-based. So PowerShell is one of your only realistic ways to get an entire output of the state of your Azure Active Directory. Usernames, permissions, group memberships, all that stuff, right? You can dump it into a CSV file or other structured database instance. That type of administrative data really matters. Application data is also best accessed this way. The closest thing I've ever seen to the best practice correct way, for instance, on a Power BI report to output it, is you end up querying it with a PowerShell command and saying, these are all the report parameters, and it's output as some combination of JSON objects and array values that can then be put back in through a opposite direction PowerShell command if you had to recreate it, that kind of thing. So if third-party products are not in the interest, this is very much a self-service way to do it. They are repeatable and automatable. There are certainly considerations you have to worry about. How do you want to assign the use of secrets and administrative capabilities to whatever environment is going to be executing this type of PowerShell script? I certainly very much recommend looking at how to do this not as a username password static secret, but instead token-based. You can use modern authentication framework with repeatable PowerShell events to create a object inside Azure Active Directory that is an enterprise application registration and works exactly as you would think. The on-premise equivalent would be something like a managed service account, a durable, repeating, self-referencing secret that does not have interactive user logon capability, but affords a software process correctly scoped rights to do its work. Final piece of it is individual components, individual products can output structured files. So, if you have database components in Power BI, you can dump them to a database dump. It will be a big old archive file, and that's that. It's a structured additional copy that at least has some value in designing data protection. The other big one here is obviously shipping audit logs, right? When you take audit content in structured log format and you ship it over to some kind of event management and recording system, that's a really good way to get additional copies. You're streaming out that data in as close to real time as you can manage. And the restore processes here are really about the same as what you would pull with PowerShell. Well, the protection and the restore processes. Once you create these copies, they are resident somewhere on storage. Either that storage is an object storage-like location that has in a separate administrative domain and is a protection environment, or it's storage on something that is a computer, and you can use traditional data protection tools to take backups of that computer and use those as your way to do effectively this two-stage data retention. And the restore process is then a reverse. Bring the file content back, feed the file content to the responsible service, and off you can go. The limitation to this, though, that I will say for certain pieces of it is that you're going to want to be very cognizant of how long these restore processes could take. Don't just blind accept that it will work. Simulate something. Do a disaster recovery and measure the time, and then double it. We're going to go full Scotty on this, right? Do not give time estimates that are the real deal of how long it takes. Program the business to expect possibly longer.
Sure. On the OneDrive sync client, have you found a way to discover if the sync client has failed? A net ID or an alert that you can set up so that it, because if you got that on the desktop, doing a known folder move or something like that, sync. If it hangs and the user doesn't notice the little icon change down there, you could go days without having it sync.
That is indeed a risk. Yes, there is an event ID associated with the failure of OneDrive Sync Client to sync. It actually generates 3 of them. I have found it once, but it only gets generated once every either user login or either 12 or 24-hour period. It's not that frequent. It's not real-time constant alerting. And to notice it, you'd have to be shipping the Windows event log from the local computer to some central analysis system anyway. So, yeah, distinctly imperfect. I'll see if I can find that for you and send that over for the real event ID. Okay, last strategy I want to suggest. This is the end of it all to wrap it up. Documentation as backup is in fact a small piece, but relevant piece of this entire data protection strategy. There are specific objects and resources where it is faster to recreate them than it is to try and restore the original instance of that object. The further your organization is into using a DevOps or infrastructure as code approach, the more relevant this backup protection piece of using the documentation and recreating from scratch becomes. So this seems to really start to get into gear when we're talking about the pieces of application data that are created by developers or citizen coders, right? If we're looking at something inside the Power Apps framework, this starts to come into full life. And if we're looking at something that is composable and repeatable, it's a good deal. Now, the documentation then needs to have the similar thought process of not being stored on the same production SaaS tenant as the systems it's documenting. So, just keep that some piece of the element in mind. And what really matters with it, though, is overcoming the impact of references from downstream resources to original objects. There's one piece of it that I think is potentially unfixable. Don't count on this as a way to recreate something like Azure AD groups. Because when you recreate a group, even if you feed it the same membership, the same display name, it won't have the same GUID. And that underlying machine GUID is what's being used in the security reference database everywhere else in the permissions model. So instead, document correctly everywhere that group is referenced. As an ongoing IT discipline, when you make a reference to a group, you select it as a target, make sure that the existence of that selection is documented. And then if you had to recreate the group, then you would know, okay, we also then have to recreate these 8, 12, however many references to that group's existence in these other product areas, because you cannot dictate GUIDs during recreation. You can dictate almost every other semantic attribute of any of this stuff. You can make it match very closely, but you can't give it the same raw identifier. I think that's it.
Questions for JR?
Okay, good times. Have some extra dessert.
Thank you, JR. Does anyone have any question that is not data protection related stuff?